we've received breaking news from Buckingham Palace, which has announced that the king has been diagnosed with cancer. Let me bring you that statement from Buckingham Palace in full. In an unprecedented move that sent shock waves through the royal family, King Charles has officially named Princess Catherine as his successor. For years, Catherine has stood by Prince William, but now in a game-changing decision, she's been thrust into the spotlight as the future of the monarchy itself. This could alter the royal landscape in ways we've never imagined, and it's a move that no one saw coming. So why has King Charles made this bold, controversial decision, and what does it mean for the future of the crown? Let's break it down. The illness that shook the crown. In February 2024, Buckingham Palace dropped a quiet announcement that stopped the country cold. King Charles Roman III, who had waited almost an entire lifetime to become king, had cancer. The news didn't arrive with royal fanfare. There was no televised address or grand speech from the balcony. It came as a brief controlled update following what had originally been called a routine treatment for an enlarged prostate. Charles had always appeared solid. He had built his image around calm, reliability, and a sense of permanence. But this diagnosis was something no carefully chosen photo or well-timed handshake could hide. Suddenly, everything felt more fragile. Inside the palace, there was a shift. Outside, a wave of silent worry spread fast. This wasn't just about a man's health. It was about the monarchy's future. The palace gave little detail. No mention of what kind of cancer it was, just a vague note that it had been caught early. That choice wasn't accidental. In a world where perception is power, vagueness creates room for theories. Was it life-threatening? Could he still lead? Was a transition already being planned? The questions weren't just coming from gossip columns. They echoed in government offices, in newsrooms, and across dinner tables. After years of royal drama, this felt like another storm approaching. But this time, the uncertainty wasn't coming from the scandal. It was coming from something far more human. Despite the diagnosis, Charles didn't retreat. He returned to public duties just weeks later. The appearances were brief, but they were intentional. He smiled for the cameras, shook hands, and gave the impression of control. Even if the effort was visible behind his eyes, he wasn't just showing up for tradition. He was making a statement. Giving up the role too soon could throw everything into confusion. But behind the scenes, everyone knew the clock was ticking. His team restarted quiet succession planning, something no reigning monarch wants to discuss. Meetings were held. Contingencies were rehearsed. The thought that Charles might only wear the crown for a short time was now a realistic outcome. Even in a crisis, the royal image had to hold. Queen Camilla stayed by his side, calm and composed in every photo. Prince William leaned harder into his role, appearing more often in public, shaking more hands, smiling more politely. But beneath the surface, everything had urgency written all over it. The monarchy couldn't afford to look weak again. Not with everything it had already weathered in recent years. Just as the public was adjusting to the king's illness, another wave of emotion swept in. It came from someone who had long been seen as the heart of the new generation. Catherine had always been there, standing next to William through every major moment, smiling through press attention, and being compared to a mother-in-law she never even met. Catherine had been a steady, graceful presence, balancing modern expectations with royal tradition. And then came the statement in March 2024. Princess Catherine had cancer. The announcement landed hard. She had always appeared calm, strong, even serene. But behind the flawless exterior, she was now facing a fight that had nothing to do with public appearances. For once, in a family that often hides behind protocol and carefully crafted messages, Catherine didn't follow the script, she told the truth. Her announcement didn't come wrapped in the usual palace ribbon. There were no gold crests or long-winded statements from the press office. Instead, it was a video deliberately quiet, carefully composed, and deeply human. She spoke of her cancer diagnosis, the preventative chemotherapy that had already begun, and the emotional toll that came with saying it out loud. More than a princess, the reaction was immediate. For once, the headlines all pointed in the same direction. From hospital wards to television screens, the outpouring came fast. Cancer patients, survivors, families, they all saw her. And for the first time in a long time, they saw the crown not as a symbol of distance, but of shared experience. Even the media softened. The usual swarm of paparazzi and gossip columns pulled back. For a brief moment, Catherine wasn't just the Princess of Wales. She was someone's sister, someone's friend, someone going through something too many understood all too well. She had made the monarchy human again. Then, as summer faded, the news came quietly. But clearly chemotherapy was complete, and just like that a weight lifted not just for her family but for the nation. In January 2025, she entered remission, but her return didn't echo the same rhythm as before. The woman who came back wasn't the same one who had stepped away. She stepped back into the public eye not just as a royal, but as someone who had walked through fire. She was no longer just the polished partner to a future king or the mother balancing tradition with modernity. She had survived something that cracked her wide open and put her back together with more force than before. Then came the rose. It was called Catherine's rose, and its creation wasn't just about beauty. This flower had been cultivated with care by Harkness roses, chosen for its delicate scent and resilience. But more than its petals or its perfume, it was its purpose that mattered. Each sale supported the Royal Marston Cancer Charity, the same institution that had supported her through treatment. It wasn't a press stunt or a garden ornament. It was a message, a quiet but powerful symbol that told a different kind of royal story, one built not on perfection but survival. In May 2025, when the rose debuted at the Chelsea Flower Show, it wasn't just placed among the flowers. It stood as a declaration, a subtle but bold moment that rewrote what strength looked like in a royal garden. Catherine didn't need to say anything. The message was already planted. She had faced illness without flinching. She had returned not to resume the old role, but to rewrite it. And now her journey bloomed not just in news headlines or charity campaigns, but in gardens across the country. But the rose wasn't the only floral tribute tied to her name. In fact, the royal garden had been blooming for years, tracing the story of her family through carefully chosen flowers. In 2013, after the birth of Prince George, a daffodil named Georgie Boy was unveiled. It was bright, upright, and unshaken. Not just a spring flower, but a quiet promise for the future. It wasn't for beauty. It was for symbolism, strength, loyalty, and a solid start. 2 years later, when Princess Charlotte was born, her bloom was softer, a light pink chrysanthemum released just after her birth, where George's flower was bold. Charlotte's spoke of grace, unassuming and steady, like the first glimpse of a personality that didn't need to shout. Then, in 2018, came Prince Louis, and with him the most untraditional bloom of all, the Cletus Prince Louis flower didn't stand still. It stretched and climbed and surprised people with its direction that made sense. Louis had become the royal wildcard. Playful, animated, unpredictable, his flower didn't follow formality, it followed joy. These floral tributes weren't just random gestures. They were soft signals of how the public connected with this generation of royals. They showed strength in George, grace in Charlotte, and spontaneity in Louis. And behind all of them there was Catherine. She wasn't just raising the next generation, she was shaping how they were seen. Not with grand speeches or declarations, but with careful choices, with gestures that lasted. By April 2025, William and Catherine had been married for 14 years. But there was no royal gala, no glittering toast. They marked it in Scotland quietly in the same place their story began, St. Andrews. Just the two of them back where it started. Their marriage had already been tested by headlines, by public pressure, by long stretches apart, and now by illness. But somehow it didn't weaken them, it cemented something deeper. They walked through the university town like old friends, retracing their steps. Locals noticed the familiarity in their pace, the way they lingered near the dorms where it all began. Catherine smiled more than usual. William stayed close, protective in a way that seemed instinctive, not performative. He didn't wave to the occasional passerby with the usual practiced charm. He barely noticed them. His eyes stayed on her. For a couple that had lived nearly every chapter of their relationship in the public eye, this was the one part they kept for themselves. There were no press releases, no photos published by the palace, only a quiet acknowledgment, perhaps even to themselves, that everything had changed. And yet nothing had a different kind of strength. Catherine, fresh from the hardest chapter of her life, no longer looked like someone simply surviving royalty. She looked like someone reshaping it. Her illness had left visible marks, less on her face and more in the quiet strength behind her eyes. William saw it too, but not as a prince watching his wife return to duty. He stood by her as someone who had carried her through it, not with grand speeches, but through quiet consistency. Their connection now looked less like fairy tale romance and more like something earned. While the royal family maintained its usual silence during her treatment, William stayed in the background, steady and focused. He managed formal duties with one hand and held the family together with the other, inside hospital rooms and long corridors away from the headlines. He was simply a husband, present, protective, and painfully human. So when Catherine finally reappeared in public, she didn't do it alone. William was beside her, but he wasn't guiding or shielding. He was matching her pace, making space. Their unity didn't come from orchestrated appearances, but from the unspoken truth that they had endured something very few could understand. The world saw them differently now. This wasn't the polished couple that tabloids once tried to reduce to royal clichés. It was something more grounded. What began as a young love story at a university had evolved into a kind of alliance built on real pain, real choices, and quiet resilience. That quietness became their power. Their presence began to feel more comforting than ceremonial, and suddenly people weren't just watching them, they were rooting for them. But while the admiration deepened, something else began to shift. Catherine, once seen as the supportive wife standing just behind the future king, was now walking her own path, and the world was watching her take each step. Her connection with William wasn't fading. It was just no longer the only part of her story. The woman once known for being graceful in silence was now speaking, leading, acting with intent. She had entered a different phase of royal life. Inside palace walls, that shift was impossible to ignore. There was a time when the title, the people's princess, belonged to only one figure. Diana had etched it into history through both defiance and heartbreak. But years later, as the royal family tried to rebuild its image, a quieter echo started forming. Catherine, not because she replaced Diana, but because she carried something familiar forward. The resemblance was subtle, less about beauty, more about presence. Catherine didn't try to imitate Diana, but she had stepped into spaces that Diana once stood in. Hospitals, charities, moments of raw human pain, and she brought something new, stability. Unlike Diana, who was often caught in conflict with the institution, Catherine seemed to understand the game and change it from the inside. She didn't rebel, she refined it. Her causes were personal, not performative. Her interest in early childhood development and mental health wasn't a seasonal PR move. It was persistent, studied, and real. Her speeches began to reflect that. What started as scripted appearances turned into confident, heartfelt talks. She spoke like someone who had been changed by life, not just trained by protocol, and the public noticed. Catherine didn't seek applause, but her impact didn't need one. Every gesture, every visit, every word carefully chosen. It all began to build something larger. She became a symbol of quiet reform. She wasn't shaking the monarchy from the outside. She was recalibrating it from within. Catherine walked a line that few royals ever managed. She upheld tradition while making it feel relevant. Her wardrobe nodded to history while her initiatives pointed toward the future. And when she didn't speak, her silence carried weight, not emptiness. She didn't beg for headlines. They followed her anyway. But with admiration came pressure. People didn't just see Catherine as a royal anymore. They began to see her as the monarchy's future. They imagined what kind of queen she could become, not based on bloodline, but based on behavior. She wasn't simply liked, she was trusted. And inside the royal institution, where image is everything, that trust made her the most valuable asset they had. Catherine wasn't asking for power, but the public was already giving it to her. Not through votes, but through attention, through the belief that she could bridge the monarchy's past and its future without losing herself in either. Catherine's rising influence. As Catherine endured, her story became a beacon of strength for the monarchy. The more she faced, the more the public and the institution invested in her journey. Unlike the shadow of Diana, which once seemed overwhelming, now it seemed to guide Catherine's path. But with the growing light of admiration came a mounting responsibility. Catherine's rising influence was not just a personal victory. It was transforming the monarchy itself. The old guard felt it, and the public demanded more. The institution, often slow to adjust, was now being pulled along by her momentum. As 2025 progressed, whispers about the future of the monarchy began to stir. The conversation around succession became louder. King Charles, though determined and composed, was no longer seen as an unshakable symbol of royal endurance. Royal insiders quietly acknowledged an uncomfortable truth. His health, while stable, remained fragile. Behind the closed doors of Buckingham Palace, the royal machinery was no longer just anticipating the inevitable, it was preparing for it. Documents that had been sealed for years were being reviewed. Protocols once archived were dusted off, not for a state funeral, but for something much more immediate, a premature handover of power. The question was no longer if King Charles would step aside, but when the weight of this question was felt by even the king's most trusted advisers. Tensions lingered in the air, unspoken but undeniable. At the heart of this shifting narrative were the couple who the world had started to see in a new light, Prince William and Princess Catherine. What was once a distant monarchy, with William and Catherine quietly standing in the background, was now transforming. The royal couple's roles were no longer just about waiting for their time. Instead, they were beginning to take center stage. Their public engagements were growing more frequent, and their presence at major events was increasing. Behind the scenes, the palace communications team subtly shifted the spotlight onto them. Headlines no longer asked whether William would one day become king, but how soon. And it wasn't just the media that was fueling the fire. Sources close to the royal family confirmed that private meetings had taken on a new strategic tone. Legal teams were reviewing estates, and military briefings that were once reserved for the reigning monarch were now being shared with William. The monarchy was moving, and the public was noticing. As these subtle shifts became more pronounced, the public's curiosity turned into expectation. Polls showed an increasing number of people supporting an early transition of power. The monarchy, they believed, needed the stability, vision, and energy that William and Catherine represented. The royal institution was now faced with a delicate balance, honoring King Charles's legacy and his ongoing fight against illness, while acknowledging that the monarchy's future depended on adapting to change. Every move William and Catherine made seemed more calculated yet necessary. A handshake wasn't just a handshake. It became a signal of things to come. A speech was a test run for leadership. The palace, cautious and deliberate, moved steadily toward a potential shift in the monarchy that would be historic. But beyond the logistical and public changes, something deeply personal was unfolding. a shift that hadn't been fully captured by the cameras or the press. Amid the political maneuvering, one unexpected moment would change the tone of this transition. It wasn't William who would play the central role. It was Catherine. King Charles invited Catherine to a private lunch away from the cameras and the royal entourage. This was a significant gesture. The monarch, whose reign was now overshadowed by uncertainty, was meeting with the woman who was not only a wife and mother, but also a figure standing on the brink of something far greater. This meeting between Catherine and Charles wasn't just about tradition, it was about the future of the monarchy, the evolving role of Catherine. Behind closed doors something shifted. It wasn't just the tone of the meeting that changed, but the balance of power itself. The palace, as expected, remained tight-lipped, issuing no statements about what had transpired, but in the absence of official comment, speculation exploded. What was discussed during this private moment between King Charles and Catherine? Was it a simple conversation about her recovery and return to public life? Or was it something deeper, a subtle recognition of the role Catherine was quietly being groomed to take on? For years, Catherine had been seen as the gracious consort, the supportive yet secondary figure in the royal family. Her role was never in question, but it was always behind the scenes. But now, with King Charles's health struggles and William's quiet preparations for the crown, Catherine was becoming something more. She was evolving into a sovereign presence, not just a figurehead. And in that private meeting with the king, it seemed as though he was ready to acknowledge this shift, if only to her. Royal watchers were quick to read between the lines, analyzing every detail, the timing, the scheduling, even the leaked lunch menu. Everything was scrutinized. But the true significance of the meeting wasn't in the specifics. It was in the symbolism of it all. Here was a king unsure of how much longer he could wear the crown, sitting with the woman who, in the eyes of the public, had already begun to wear it in spirit. This wasn't a meeting about formal succession planning. It was something much more intimate and powerful. It was a moment of reckoning, a quiet acknowledgement of Catherine's growing role, and perhaps it was a transfer of trust, a recognition that the future of the monarchy was in capable hands. In the days that followed, the changes became more apparent. Catherine was given more solo engagements, her responsibilities quietly expanding, her proximity to the queen consort increased, and her presence beside William felt more commanding. It was about standing beside him as an equal. Commentators started to describe Catherine not just as a future queen, but as a current architect of the royal image. Her influence was no longer something far off in the future, it was happening now in real time, and the public responded in kind. Approval ratings soared, not just for William's eventual reign, but for Catherine's leadership alongside him. The people were actively rooting for it. If that lunch was indeed a passing of the torch, it wasn't just from a king to a princess. It marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. This wasn't just about tradition anymore. It was about a new vision for the monarchy, one shaped by empathy, endurance, and grace, forged through adversity. Catherine hadn't sought power, she had earned it quietly, and with great resilience she had transformed from a university student thrust into the spotlight to a duchess shaped by duty. She was a mother forged by crisis, and a survivor now commanding the admiration of an entire nation. Catherine's story is no longer just about being royal. It's about resilience. It's about transformation. And most of all, it's about the quiet, unstoppable force of a woman who didn't reach for power, but became impossible to overlook. As the monarchy moves through this new chapter, one thing is clear, that Catherine's journey is not only about royal duties. It's about rewriting the rules of what it means to lead with strength, grace, and purpose. She may not wear the crown yet, but it's already settled on her shoulders in the eyes of the public. So what do you think? Is Catherine already the future queen in spirit? Or is there still a long road ahead before she truly steps into that role? Drop your thoughts below.